They taught us to share everything, every moment, every feeling, every blessing, every wound, as if our lives only become real once they are witnessed, validated, reacted to, as if silence is a form of disappearance, as if privacy means you have something to hide. But Islam comes and quietly, gently, radically says something very different. It says, not everything sacred is meant to be seen. Not everything precious survives exposure, and not every battle needs an audience. There is a kind of peace that only exists in secrecy, a kind of strength that only grows when it is protected, and a kind of relationship with Allah that can only survive when it is hidden from the noise of the world. Islam teaches you to stay private, not because life is shameful, but because it is sacred, because the heart is fragile, because intentions are delicate, because envy is real, because the soul is easily corrupted by applause and easily wounded by criticism. Islam does not train you to perform your life. It trains you to preserve it. There is something profoundly countercultural about Islam's approach to privacy. We live in a world that rewards exposure. The louder you are, the more visible you are, the more you are seen. But Islam is not concerned with being seen. Islam is concerned with being sincere, and sincerity cannot survive under constant observation. One of the first things Islam teaches you is that your relationship with Allah is deeply personal. Your prayers are not meant to impress anyone. Your tears are not meant to convince anyone. Your repentance is not meant to be broadcast. There are acts of worship that are meant to be public, yes, but the most powerful ones are often hidden. The Prophet A spoke of a person who gives charity so secretly that even their own left hand does not know what their right hand has given. Why? Because when no one is watching, the ego has nothing to feed on. And when the ego starves, the soul finally has room to breathe. Islam understands something about the human heart that modern culture ignores. The heart changes when it is watched. It performs. It edits. It exaggerates. It begins to crave validation instead of truth. And slowly, without realizing it, your life stops being lived for Allah and starts being lived for an audience. Privacy is protection from that shift. When you keep something between you and Allah, you preserve its purity. You allow it to be fueled by intention rather than reaction. You allow it to grow roots instead of leaves, because leaves attract attention. Roots create life. This is why Islam warns against exposing sins. Not because Allah wants you to pretend to be perfect, but because exposing sins hardens the heart. When something shameful becomes public, it loses its weight. It loses its ability to humble you, and humility is the doorway to transformation. Islam wants you to feel the seriousness of your mistakes so that you return to Allah sincerely, not perform repentance for sympathy or validation. There is a difference between seeking help and seeking an audience. Islam encourages you to seek counsel from the right people, in the right way, at the right time, but it discourages you from turning your wounds into content. Because wounds need care, not commentary. Your pain is not a product. One of the greatest misunderstandings of our time is the idea that sharing equals healing. Sometimes it does, but often sharing prematurely deepens the wound, because not everyone is safe. Not everyone is sincere. Not everyone wants your healing. Some want your story for entertainment. Some want it for comparison. Some want it to feel better about themselves. Islam protects you from that harm by teaching you discretion. There is a reason the Quran speaks about the evil of envy. There is a reason the Prophet A taught us to seek protection from the evil eye. Islam does not pretend that hearts are always pure. It does not assume everyone celebrates your joy with sincerity. So it teaches you to guard your blessings. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. You do not owe the world access to your happiness. There are things that grow best in the dark. Seeds do not sprout under spotlights. They sprout underground. And your dreams, your healing, your intentions, your relationships, they are seeds. when you expose them too early, they become vulnerable. Vulnerable to doubt, vulnerable to opinions, vulnerable to energies that were never meant to touch them. Islam teaches you to protect your peace by limiting access. Not everyone deserves a front row seat to your life. Not everyone needs to know your plans. Not everyone needs to understand your choices. And not everyone will be happy for you when you succeed. Privacy is not secrecy out of fear. It is boundaries out of self-respect. One of the most powerful forms of peace is living without explanation. Islam frees you from the exhausting need to justify yourself. You do not have to narrate your obedience. You do not have to announce your growth. You do not have to defend your healing. When your compass is Allah, you no longer need constant approval from creation. And this is deeply liberating, because the more you share, the more opinions you invite. And opinions are heavy. They sit on your chest. They pull at your heart. They confuse your intentions. They blur your clarity. Islam understands that peace requires focus, and focus requires silence. This is why the Prophet lived with such profound simplicity and restraint. His life was not a performance. His worship was not a spectacle. His humility was not an image. He did not rush to announce blessings or complain about hardships. He turned to Allah first, always. Islam teaches you to take your needs to the one who can actually meet them. There is a quiet strength in that, a dignity, a groundedness. When you stop seeking emotional relief from people who cannot give it and start seeking it from Allah, something shifts inside you. You are no longer dependent on reactions. You are no longer shaken by indifference. You are no longer crushed by misunderstanding. Because Allah understands without explanation, privacy also protects your intentions. When you speak less about what you plan to do, you give your intention room to remain sincere. The moment you announce something, the ego sneaks in. It asks, how will this look? Who will know? What will they think? And suddenly, the act is no longer about Allah. It is about image. Islam trains you to ask a different question: is Allah pleased? That question does not require an audience. And this is especially important in a time where goodness itself has become performative, where charity is documented, where worship is aesthetic, where spirituality is branded. Islam cuts through all of that and brings you back to the core. Who are you when no one is watching? That is who you truly are. Protecting your peace also means protecting your emotional space. Islam teaches emotional boundaries long before psychology gave it a name. It teaches you not to expose your heart to everyone. Not every listener is a caretaker. Some are consumers. And when you give your heart to the wrong hands, you pay the price in anxiety, regret, and spiritual exhaustion. The heart is an amana, a trust, and you are responsible for how you guard it. This is why Islam encourages modesty, not just in dress, but in speech, behavior, and exposure. Modesty is not about shrinking. It is about protecting what is valuable. You do not put diamonds on the sidewalk. You do not leave priceless things unattended. And your inner world is priceless. When Islam tells you to stay private, it is telling you know your worth. There is also mercy in privacy. Mercy for yourself. When you do not constantly broadcast your struggles, you allow yourself to process them without pressure. You allow yourself to be human without being judged. You allow yourself to grow without being scrutinized. Growth is messy. Repentance is messy. Healing is non-linear. And when every step is observed, the fear of falling can paralyze you. Islam gives you the gift of unseen growth. Growth that happens quietly, imperfectly, sincerely. Some of the most beautiful transformations happen in silence. Islam also teaches you that not everything requires commentary. Silence is not weakness. Silence is wisdom. The Prophet taught that whoever believes in Allah and the last day should speak good or remain silent. This is not just about avoiding harm to others. It is about protecting yourself. Every word you release carries energy, and excessive speech drains the soul. When you speak less, you listen more. When you listen more, you reflect more. When you reflect more, you become more aware of Allah. Noise drowns awareness. This is why so much of peace is found in restraint. Restraint of speech, restraint of exposure, restraint of reaction. Islam does not want you constantly reacting to life. It wants you responding with consciousness. Privacy gives you that space. And then there is the concept of reliance. Tawakkul, true reliance on Allah, requires a certain detachment from people. Not abandonment, but balance. When you stop needing people to validate your choices, your emotions, your worth, you become freer to rely on Allah fully. Islam teaches you to turn inward before turning outward, to ask Allah before asking creation, to cry in sujud before crying online, not because your pain is invalid, but because Allah is more capable of holding it. And when you share intentionally, with wisdom, with purpose, with the right people, not impulsively, not emotionally, not publicly, by default. This intentionality is a form of self-respect. Protecting your peace also means protecting your time. Constant sharing takes time. It takes emotional energy. It takes mental bandwidth. Islam teaches you to value time as a trust. And one of the fastest ways to waste time is to live for reaction. When you are always checking who saw, who responded, who approved, you are not present. You are fragmented. Islam calls you back to presence. Presence in prayer, presence in relationships, presence with Allah, and presence requires boundaries. There is a deep serenity that comes from being unknown to most people, but deeply known to Allah. A serenity that no amount of likes can replicate. A serenity that does not fluctuate with public opinion. A serenity that anchors you when life shakes. Islam offers you that serenity, but it asks something in return: restraint. Restraint is not deprivation. It is discernment. It is knowing what to keep between you and Allah, what to share with trusted companions, and what to leave unspoken entirely. It is knowing that some moments lose their meaning once they are explained, that some blessings fade once they are displayed, that some intentions weaken once they are announced. Islam trusts you with that wisdom. And perhaps the most powerful aspect of privacy in Islam is that it protects your relationship with Allah from becoming transactional. When your worship is private, you do not measure it by response. You do not perform for praise. You do not calculate its value by visibility. You simply offer it, and offering something without expectation is one of the purest forms of love. Islam teaches you to love Allah in that way. Quietly, deeply, consistently, away from the noise. This is why protecting your peace is not selfish. It is spiritual. It is an act of worship. It is choosing depth over display, truth over trend, sincerity over spectacle, and in a world that is constantly pulling you outward, Islam gently pulls you back inward, back to your heart, back to your intention, back to Allah. Not everything needs to be said, not everything needs to be seen, and not everything needs to be shared for it to be real. Some of the most powerful things in your life are meant to remain unseen. Privacy in Islam is not rooted in fear, shame, or insecurity. It is rooted in protection. It is the understanding that not everything valuable survives exposure, and that the heart, like anything precious, requires safeguarding. Islam does not teach privacy because life is something to hide from others, but because the inner world of a person is sacred and easily affected. When something is constantly observed, it changes. Intentions shift, sincerity weakens, and the quiet connection between the servant and Allah becomes crowded with noise. Privacy, in this sense, is a spiritual boundary that protects what matters most. The human heart is not designed to live under constant observation. When every action is witnessed and every emotion is shared, the heart begins to perform rather than exist. Islam recognizes this vulnerability and responds with wisdom. By encouraging discretion, Islam preserves the purity of intention. Acts done away from public view remain free from the desire to impress, compete, or be validated. In that hidden space, worship becomes honest, repentance becomes sincere, and growth becomes real. What is protected has the chance to mature, while what is exposed too early often becomes distorted or depleted. Islam also understands that not every gaze carries goodwill. Envy exists, comparison exists, misunderstanding exists. When blessings are exposed without wisdom, they become vulnerable to harm, not only from others but from the self. Pride can quietly creep in, and gratitude can weaken. Privacy shields blessings from being turned into sources of anxiety or arrogance. It allows gratitude to remain intimate and grounded, rooted in humility rather than display. What remains between the believer and Allah carries a depth that public acknowledgement cannot replicate. There is also mercy in privacy. When mistakes are kept between the servant and Allah, the heart remains soft. Shame retains its corrective power, guiding the soul back rather than pushing it into numbness. Islam does not encourage public exposure of sins because it wants to preserve the sensitivity of the heart. When wrong actions are normalized through repetition and display, repentance loses its urgency. Privacy preserves accountability while leaving space for transformation, allowing the individual to grow without being defined by their lowest moments. Privacy is not isolation, nor is it denial of help. Islam encourages seeking guidance, counsel, and support, but with discernment. The difference lies in intention and audience. Seeking help is about healing, while exposing oneself indiscriminately often leads to harm. By teaching privacy, Islam empowers the believer to choose wisely, to protect their emotional and spiritual space, and to engage the world from a place of strength rather than vulnerability. In this protection, the soul finds room to breathe, the heart finds stability, and faith finds the quiet environment it needs to take root and deepen. Sincerity is fragile, and Islam treats it as something that must be guarded carefully. When actions are constantly seen, evaluated, and reacted to, the heart begins to shift its focus without even realizing it. What starts as a sincere intention to please Allah can slowly turn into a desire to be acknowledged by people. Islam understands this subtle danger and therefore places immense value on what is done in secret. When no one is watching, the ego has nothing to feed on, and the soul is free to act purely for Allah alone. Hidden acts of worship hold a unique power because they are untouched by performance. A prayer offered in solitude, a tear shed in the darkness of the night, a charity given without recognition carries a weight that public acts often struggle to maintain. In secrecy, the believer confronts themselves honestly. There is no image to maintain, no reputation to protect, and no applause to anticipate. The heart stands exposed before Allah alone, and in that exposure, sincerity becomes possible. Islam nurtures this space because it is where true faith is cultivated. When actions are public, the heart becomes divided. Part of it turns toward Allah, while another part listens for praise, watches for approval, or fears criticism. This division weakens the spiritual impact of the act. Islam seeks to unify the heart, to free it from competing motives. By encouraging hidden worship, Islam allows the believer to act with wholeness. The intention becomes clear, focused, and undiluted. The act becomes an offering rather than a statement, a devotion rather than a display. Sincerity also grows in silence because silence protects the heart from comparison. When people observe one another's deeds, the soul can fall into subtle competition. Who gives more, who prays longer, who appears more devout. Even when unintended, comparison erodes humility and replaces it with self-measurement. Islam removes this pressure by shifting the focus away from what others see and toward what Allah knows. What Allah knows is not how impressive the act looked, but how sincere the heart was when it was done. In secrecy, accountability deepens. When no one else knows of an act, there is no external reward to rely on. The believer learns to act without immediate gratification, trusting that Allah sees and records every intention. This trust strengthens faith and builds a quiet resilience within the heart. The believer becomes less dependent on people's reactions and more anchored in divine awareness. Over time, this creates stability. Praise no longer inflates the ego, and criticism no longer shatters the soul. Islam teaches that the truest measure of a person is who they are when no one is watching. Hidden actions reveal the reality of the heart because they are chosen without pressure or reward. In that unseen space, sincerity is not forced, it naturally emerges. The believer learns to act not for recognition, not for image, and not for approval, but solely for Allah, and in that purity. Faith strengthens, the heart softens, and the connection with Allah deepens beyond what public display could ever produce. Islam makes a careful distinction between sharing for healing and sharing for exposure, and this distinction protects the dignity of the human heart. Not every form of expression leads to relief, and not every listener is a source of safety. In a world that encourages constant disclosure, Islam approaches pain with restraint and wisdom. It teaches that wounds are not meant to be displayed, but treated, and that healing requires the right environment, not unlimited visibility. When pain becomes public too quickly, it often deepens rather than softens. The heart is vulnerable in moments of struggle, and vulnerability needs protection. Islam does not deny emotional pain or discourage seeking help, but it insists on discernment. There is a profound difference between turning to someone who can guide, support, and heal, and turning to an audience that consumes stories without carrying responsibility for their impact. When pain is shared without intention or wisdom, it can invite judgment, misunderstanding, and comparison, all of which add layers of harm to an already fragile heart. Islam recognizes that not everyone who listens is sincere. Some listen out of curiosity, some out of superiority, and some out of boredom. When personal struggles are exposed widely, they become subject to opinions that were never asked for and advice that was never appropriate. This can leave a person feeling more isolated than before, misunderstood rather than supported. By encouraging privacy, Islam preserves emotional dignity and prevents the heart from being wounded repeatedly by careless reactions. There is also a spiritual cost to indiscriminate sharing. When hardship is constantly verbalized without reflection, it can become an identity rather than a phase. The person begins to define themselves by their pain instead of seeing it as a temporary test. Islam teaches believers to take their deepest complaints to Allah, not because others do not care, but because Allah understands without explanation. In turning to Allah first, the heart finds relief without exposure and support without judgment. Seeking help in Islam is intentional. It is done with trusted individuals, people of wisdom, or those qualified to assist. This form of sharing is purposeful and contained, aimed at growth rather than attention. It allows the person to receive guidance while maintaining self-respect. Islam does not teach silence that suffocates, but discretion that protects. It encourages expression that heals, not exposure that exploits. Healing is often quiet. It requires space, patience, and reflection. When struggles are not constantly narrated, the heart has room to process, to grow, and to reconnect with Allah. Islam values this inner work and shields it from unnecessary disturbance. By limiting who has access to one's pain, the believer preserves their emotional energy and allows healing to unfold naturally. In this way, Islam honors the heart, teaching that it is not meant to be consumed by the world, but cared for with wisdom, intention, and mercy until strength is restored and peace begins to return. Islam places great emphasis on boundaries because peace cannot exist without them. The heart was not created to be open to everyone, nor was the inner life meant to be accessible without discernment. When boundaries are absent, emotional exhaustion follows, and the soul becomes overwhelmed by opinions, expectations, and reactions. Islam understands this reality and teaches restraint as a form of mercy. By limiting access to one's inner world, a believer protects their emotional dignity and preserves the calm necessary for spiritual clarity. Boundaries in Islam are not walls built out of fear, but doors that are opened with intention. Not every relationship requires full disclosure, and not every interaction deserves emotional investment. When the heart is given freely and without wisdom, it becomes scattered and drained. Islam teaches the believer to be selective, to recognize that peace depends on knowing when to engage and when to withdraw. This discernment allows the heart to remain centered rather than pulled in countless directions by the needs and opinions of others. Emotional boundaries also protect intention. When too many people are involved in one's decisions or struggles, clarity weakens. Advice becomes contradictory, expectations multiply, and the heart loses its sense of direction. Islam encourages turning inward and upward before turning outward. By consulting Allah through prayer and reflection first, the believer grounds their decisions in faith rather than noise. This internal anchoring creates confidence and reduces dependence on external validation. Restraint in speech is another essential boundary taught by Islam. Words carry weight, and excessive speech often leads to regret, misunderstanding, and spiritual fatigue. When everything is said, nothing is preserved. Islam encourages silence when speech does not bring benefit, not as suppression, but as protection. Through silence, the believer avoids unnecessary conflict, preserves energy, and maintains emotional balance. Peace is often found not in what is expressed, but in what is wisely withheld. Protecting emotional space also means resisting the pressure to explain oneself constantly. Islam frees the believer from the burden of justifying every choice, feeling, or transformation. When actions are rooted in sincerity and guided by faith, they do not require public approval. This freedom allows the heart to remain steady even when misunderstood. The believer learns to trust their relationship with Allah more than the perceptions of people, and in doing so, gains inner stability. Boundaries create space for presence. When the heart is not overstimulated by constant interaction and disclosure, it becomes more attentive to the moment. Presence deepens prayer, strengthens relationships, and increases awareness of Allah. Islam values this state of attentiveness and encourages practices that support it. By protecting one's emotional world through boundaries, the believer cultivates peace not as an escape from life, but as a way of engaging with it more consciously. In this protection, the heart finds rest, the mind finds clarity, and the soul finds the quiet strength it needs to remain grounded amid the demands and distractions of the world. At the core of inner peace is a shift in where the heart seeks recognition. Islam gently redirects the believer away from the need to be known, praised, or understood by people and toward the contentment of being known by Allah. When a person lives for public approval, their emotional state becomes unstable, rising with praise and falling with criticism. Islam recognizes the fragility of this dependence and offers a more stable source of peace, one that does not fluctuate with opinion or attention. Being known by Allah means trusting that nothing is unseen, unheard, or unnoticed. Every intention, struggle, and effort is fully recognized by the one who created the heart. This awareness frees the believer from the exhausting need to explain themselves to others. Misunderstandings no longer demand correction, and silence no longer feels like erasure. When Allah is the primary witness, the believer finds reassurance even in obscurity. Their worth is not measured by visibility, but by sincerity. Reliance on Allah transforms the way the believer interacts with people. Instead of seeking validation, they engage from a place of wholeness. Approval becomes a bonus rather than a necessity. This shift creates emotional independence, allowing the heart to remain steady regardless of external response. Islam nurtures this independence by constantly reminding the believer of divine nearness. Allah is closer than anyone else, more aware than any observer, and more capable of responding to the needs of the soul. When a person anchors their peace in being known by Allah, their actions become more authentic. They no longer perform goodness to be seen, nor do they hide their struggles to maintain an image. Their focus shifts to alignment rather than appearance. This alignment brings coherence to the heart, reducing inner conflict and strengthening spiritual clarity. Life becomes less about managing perceptions and more about maintaining connection. This perspective also softens the heart toward others. When the believer is no longer dependent on people for validation, resentment decreases. Disappointment becomes easier to process, and forgiveness becomes more attainable. The heart learns to accept human limitations without bitterness, understanding that people cannot offer what only Allah can provide. This understanding protects peace by removing unrealistic expectations from relationships. Islam teaches that true peace is not loud or visible. It is quiet, rooted, and resilient. It exists even when no one applauds and endures even when misunderstood. By centering the heart on Allah's awareness rather than human attention, the believer steps out of the fragile world of constant evaluation and into a space of stability. In this space, the soul finds rest, the heart finds confidence, and faith deepens beyond performance. The believer moves through life grounded in divine presence, carrying a peace that does not depend on recognition, explanation, or approval, but flows naturally from the certainty of being fully seen, fully known, and fully cared for by Allah.